at what point do you need to tune your car? So for example,
a real clean stock car, but like a lot of these totally stock cars.
What are some of the common mistakes that you see people make?
Under the hood is a 399-inch Ford-based motor. It's a dart block. I've seen situations where there's a clearance between the throttle position sensor and the actual throttle body.
Well, Matthew, thank you very much for joining us. I figured the best way to maybe introduce yourself was to maybe tell a little bit of a story as to how you and I met. In 2017, I went to a lot of trouble to do a heads, cam, and intake swap on my car. And I enlisted in the both parts assistance and knowledge assistance of Western Motorsports in Calgary, Alberta. And Shannon and the guys over there were kind enough to pass Matthew's information along to me as the local Foxbody guru as to when you're done putting all your hard parts on your car, you got to go see this guy. He's the only guy that we trust, and he's going to get your car right. So I had reached out to Mathew to see if he was interested in tuning my car, and no prior contact between he and I. He didn't know my car or anything. So he said, yeah, sure, that's what we're in the business of doing. And what kind of car are we working on? And I said, what's a 92 Foxbody 5-liter? And the phone kind of went dead for a little bit. And he goes, what did you do to it? And who did the work? And all the right questions that a shop should ask. And I told him, and he said, well, listen, as you know, these cars are one of the most modified cars out there. And typically, a dozen people or more have had their hands on that car. And I don't know what I get myself into. I mean, this thing could be spliced and wired and cut and who knows what. And I said, well, listen, I think I'll pleasantly surprise you with this car, but there's no hard feelings. If I bring you all the way down to the shop and you see my car and you say, no, thanks, I'm totally good with that. So we met at Matthew's shop on a Saturday. He was kind enough to work on the weekend for me. And I kind of showed up first. I was quite excited to get my car all set up. I just spent months and months putting it all together. And Mathew showed up and got out of his car and says, holy Christ, where did you find this thing? It looks like it should be in a bloody museum. So anyway, the hood's popped and we do our deal. And he goes, all right, let's put her on the rollers. Mathew, why don't you give us a little breakdown on what your background is and how you got into the whole dyno tuning and everything else. It's not just dyno tuning that you do, but I'll let you tell that story.
Yeah, sure. Well, I kind of smile when I hear a story like this because guys call me all the time with Fox bodies. I've done a lot with Fox bodies over the years. I think on the phone, I often sound like a guy who doesn't like these cars because I start going on about the 13 owners and how the cars, most of them left the dealership with the tires smoking. And then the first stop was the speed shop before they even put a tank of gas in them. So you're looking at cars that have had everything under the sun cut into the wiring harness. And that's usually one of the, rough points on these cars. Now, I almost never say no to a Fox body, but I try to establish a realistic expectation with guys as to what could happen, because there are lots of guys out there who think, well, Matthew's going to wave his magic wand with the computer and all of my bad decisions and physical problems and previous hatchet men on the car will just magically disappear. And that's not the case. You know, I mean, I work with guys to solve problems on these cars and get them right. Now, as far as my background is concerned, I have an honors degree in computer science. I worked software for lots of years. One thing you may be familiar with is if you ever swiped your Air Miles card at a Shell station in Canada, I built that system for Shell. I ran Shell's nationwide point of sale network. That's one of the many things that I did with my career over the years. And then a little further on, I decided to open up the dyno shop. I'm also a Red Seal automotive service tech, which is, if you're in the US, you may think of this as master mechanic. In Canada, the Red Seal certification is the highest certification for a mechanic. So it's a little bit of an unusual combination. One of the reasons I opened the dyno shop is years ago when I was punching computers actually for Shell early in my career, I got headhunted by Ford Powertrain. And I wish I'd kept that email, but they wrote to me and said, why don't you put your knowledge of Mustangs and Unix computers together and come work for us at Ford Powertrain. And I wasn't very keen on moving to Michigan. I mean, whatever, I'm a fourth generation Albertan. My family homesteaded here. My grandmother and her sisters were some of the first white women born in the territory before Confederation. So I have pretty deep ties here in Alberta. But I always thought, yeah, that was a cool headhunting email to get. And maybe further on, when I'm a little bit more settled in my career, it might be good idea to, you know, have a speed shop and work on programming cars. And I mean, I think I wrote my first automotive application chips in '85, doing propane conversions on GM pickups for Superior Propane. So, I've been at it a long time, and I'm well versed in control systems, and I'm a pretty good guy to be troubleshooting these cars that are a mess. It's just that a lot of them are a mess, and you gotta be realistic when you come in.
So Mathew has a 90 notch, correct? 1990.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, 90 notch. The factory 533 Ford, the Lincoln 5-liter, the 2011 shop car, if you will.
Well, it's my summer driver. It's a Roush Stage 2 2011 GT convertible, which Kevin Marty says was a one-of-one car before I put the blower on it. So,
well, the blower makes it a lot more fun, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is.
So, with that said, I mean, I think probably for the folks that like to tag along with my car adventures, hearing a little bit of the 90 Coupe story would be well worth everyone's time, because this thing, dare I say, like world renowned. Like it is one of the quickest cars naturally aspirated.
It's one of the ultimate Fox bodies. There used to be a website called Ultimate Fox Body, and I was named one of the ultimate Fox bodies on there. I think it had a 1320 feature on the internet. But the thing about this car is, if I had lived in the Eastern United States or the Southern United States, or maybe Texas, maybe even California, I'm sure this car would have had several magazine features back in the day when magazines were, the place you went to look at cool Mustangs. But I mean, we live a long way away, and your geography sometimes dictates your opportunities for this. In fact, I mean, Alberta is full of incredible cars. I've traveled around looking at shows all over the place, and frankly, I put up the kind of cars we have here against any of them. In many cases, I think there's higher density of incredible end user built Mustangs and other cars here than there is pretty well anywhere else that I have been. Now, as far as my Coupe is concerned, it's an all motor car. It's street legal. It's registered and insured. It weighs 3,160 pounds, which is almost factory weight. And, you know, we took stuff out of it trying to save weight, but we ended up, this is frustrating because we ended up putting all that weight back in safety and strengthening and so on. I mean, because I'm a McLeod 8660 bell housing, that bell housing weighs like 40 pounds. So, you know, you think you're going to save weight with some racing part, and instead you end up having to put something heavy in to protect yourself or to meet an NHRA requirement or whatever. I raced a car all over Western Canada. You can see, I'm actually at the shop. This is a fake background. This is my trophy wall. A lot of these trophies right here are for racing. I have lots of trophies for show cars as well, but I won 15 streetcar shootouts or shootout series here in Western Canada. I won events in all three Western provinces, multiple events in all three Western provinces. The car went 944, 143, 135 60 foot. It's naturally aspirated, it runs on unleaded fuel, and it has like power windows and power locks. And I know it's tempting to think that the car is stripped. It's right here, it's sitting right in front of me actually, but it's tempting to think the car is stripped, but I invite people when they come in the shop to swing the door. The doors have all the crash beams in them. And like I said, it's got the power windows and locks and stuff in it. It's full interior, as much as you can put back in with a 10-point cage. Visors, you know how hard it is to put visors in a 10-point cage car? It's got the map light, that works. I mean, when I raced at night, it was real helpful for reading the time slips. And it was built so that we could handle approver crews. It's not really a car that's meant at this stage to drive back and forth to work, although, you know, I worked on it for like 15 years almost. And at one point, even with a solid roller, I used to drive it to work downtown. I had a big software job downtown. I had downtown parking in Calgary. I'd take this car down there on Fridays just for laughs, set off all the alarms in the parkade. In those days, it had Flowmaster 50s and like 3.5-inch exhaust, Dr. Gas X pipe, and all that. These days, it has a custom unobtainium welding exhaust on it, but which saved a lot of weight, and it actually made the car a little bit quieter.
Okay. And now, does that car have a Ford computer in it?
Well, I ran the Ford computer for quite a while, and then when we started to get into high revving, I switched to an SDS computer, which is made by an outfit called Race Tech, which actually are based here in Calgary. Western Motorsports, you mentioned earlier, sell that product, and they used to, and I think still will, sell you like a plug and play harness. So there's a harness that plugs right into your Mustang harness. You take the factory A9L out, you plug this harness in there. The other end of it has the computer connectors, DB25s and stuff that the SDS uses. You plug that into the SDS, and then it's programmed with a handheld. It's not laptop programmable, and it uses a rich lean knob. So there's a knob in most of these systems. There's a knob that you can turn. In some of them, in the air, when I built this system, there was actually a little box with a like plus and minus buttons on it. So you could enrich or lean the fuel by up to 50% with the knob, which was a good way to help get the car started. This car, I think, was the quickest and fastest SDS equipped car ever built. So.
Wow. Okay. So now this kind of leads into my next question, but before I get to that, Mathew, the rev limiter in the A9L computer is one of the only like one of the larger knocks against the computer when you're trying to do what you're doing with your coupe, right?
Well, the issue isn't the A9L. The issue is the PIP ignition system, the TFI ignition system. So what happens is the PIP signal from the distributor, from the TFI module, above about 7,000 RPM, it starts to blend together so that the computer can no longer resolve the crank trigger signal that comes from there. It's called a PIP signal in Ford terminology. And that means that the car loses its place and it shuts off. So I have run lots of big RPM cars. This car we shift at 8,800 RPM with a push rod motor. But I've got there's a couple brothers here. I set up their Foxbody Coupes for road racing, and each of them in turn won the Solo Sprint Unlimited here in Calgary when we had the track. So Solo Sprint Unlimited is a timed road race event, and the unlimited class is unlimited. So they raced against all the 911 turbos and supercharged Corvettes and kind of guys who thought they had the world by the tail. And here these two brothers, one year after another, whipped all these guys with like Foxbody Coupes. And these cars were not built with huge money. These guys have a budget like most of us with Mustangs. And anyway, one of them we tested with this motor, which was capable of running probably up around 75. I told him, like, it isn't going to work with the A9L. We're going to have to switch it if you want to run 75. But you wanted to try it and see how far we could get. And it consistently shut down 71, 7,200. That's where the PIP signal blended together. So the issue isn't really that you can't set the A9L to handle higher than about 7,000. It's that the PIP signal blends together. So like if you used a TFI distributor with the SDS, it would have exactly the same problem. I couldn't resolve the PIP signal. So I use a crank trigger with it. And that's the solution for high winders. So.
Okay. Yeah, that it's something I've heard over the years, and I definitely was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. Building off of that, I thought a good way for people to understand, because I personally, not that I'm a tuner, but I think there's a handful of folks out there that know that I have had my car tuned, and now that we're doing this, they know who's tuned it. But they ask me, well, at what point do you need to tune your car? So for example, I just installed a fresh new header, back to catback, off-road H-pipe exhaust system. Would this quantify me coming down to see you, or is the stock computer capable of understanding that there's been some changes made to my exhaust system and therefore I can calibrate myself to account for that?
Okay, so exhaust is one of these sort of a little bit gray areas. If I did a full exhaust, including headers on one of my cars, you bet I would load it on the dyno and I would tune it. Now, as far as just driving the car around, the oxygen sensor system is going to compensate for any differences, and it's going to run just fine as long as it's in closed loop, which is your part throttle or idle operation. But these Fox bodies switch to an open loop mode when you go into wide open throttle and run entirely off of a table. And generally, when you put a full exhaust like that on, generally they tend to run a little bit leaner than they do with the factory exhaust. It's usually not that bad. So is it mandatory with a change like you did to do a dyno tune on the car? No, I don't think so. I don't think it's not gonna be enough leaner that it's gonna burn the car down. Not naturally aspirated anyway. You get away with murder on a naturally aspirated car. But would it be helpful? Yeah, I think it would. I mean, I would do it on mine, but I have a hard time recommending to customers that, you know, they come and spend $1,100 or whatever to get their car dyno tuned for just an exhaust change. But if you start getting into things like fuel injector change or a mass air meter change, now you're talking about changes that really require tuning. One sort of exception is with a Foxbody. If you put on bigger injectors and then you put on a meter that's calibrated for the bigger injectors, then those cars will tend to run. But what happens is the load calculation gets off. So they'll run a little bit off, to run the wrong rows on the tables and so on. But they generally will run. And as a guideline, I would say the bigger the injector and injector calibration on the MAF, the less likely it is to just straight up work. So like if you put in 24-pound injectors and a 24-pound calibrated MAF, that probably works. If you put in 42-pound injectors and a 42-pound calibrated MAF, things are going to be a lot less likely to be, you know, right on. And those changes I strongly recommend doing a dyno tune. Now, if you put a power adder on the car of any description, absolutely, it absolutely requires a tune.
So now, just so we don't forget about the 87, 88 cars, how does that all factor in? I mean, we talked a lot about mass air, right? What's that, 89 to 93 and beyond? And a lot of people, I think if they've got one of those earlier aero cars, or even pre-aero cars, they look for an A9L and they look for a mass air meter because everybody wants a lumpy cam and everybody wants to go faster, right? So is there any hope for these cars, or is the best thing to do scrap the old system and go to mass air?
Well, you have two options, or two real options, I guess. Okay, let's start by just talking about aero cars. So 87, 88 cars are very, very similar cars to the 89 to 93 mass air cars. In 88 in California, they were mass air cars. So if you have a California 88, it would be mass air. Occasionally, you'll see like a California mass air computer come up on eBay or whatever, and those are perfectly okay to use like in place of an A9L. I can't remember the calibration ID. It's a little bit of a funny cal ID, but it's a legit mass air car. Traditionally, the right approach for 87, 88 cars was to swap them to mass air. These days, it's harder and harder to come up with a factory computer, and these computers are, 30 years old. What other 30-year-old electronics are you still using? Your TV, stereo? I mean, I have some speakers that are that old, but, which I use all the time, but everything else in my stereo is replaced, even including my vinyl record player. I have a USB vinyl record player these days. So, these computers were very resilient, but they can start to have leaky capacitors. That's one of the most common problems. It's not a big deal to desolder them and put new capacitors on. And there's guys who do that, or it's not that hard if you're handy with a soldering iron. They're not all surface mount like the later computers are. But it's harder and harder to get these computers, and guys want more and more money for them. And buying them on eBay, you don't know if you're buying one that's good or not. It's a little bit of a crapshoot. If you buy one from a guy like me, I occasionally have takeoff computers here. I will have tested them in a car and checked all the channels with a data log tool and made sure that it was a working computer. So you have a little more certainty, but you pay a more of a premium for something like that. You can still occasionally pick them up for a couple $100 on eBay, but say try buying them from Mustang Parts Specialties. I think you're looking at $650 Canadian dollars probably for a computer out of those guys. Then to do the mass air conversion, you still have to have a mass air meter. That's a couple $100. You got to have the wiring, and you've got to do it. And you've got to sometimes, depending on the particular car, you might have to screw around with the loop back in the O2 sensor harness. So there's a little bit of work there. Your alternative is a standalone, and there's a couple good options for that. A lot of guys like Holley Terminator X. The Holley system is a good system. Our friends at Western Motorsports use a Terminator X in their autocross car, for instance. That's a good way to go. Another option that I think is perfectly okay is Mega Squirt, like MS2 plug and play. That's what I put in my Lincoln. And, you know, the Lincoln, the Mark 7 is very much like one of those Aero Foxes. It's a speed density car. Whatever it is, DS9 or whatever, Lincoln computer is essentially non-programmable. And if you're going to start doing something to it, you got to change the controls to something that you can actually control. So I switched it to Mega Squirt MS2 plug and play.
So what are some of the common mistakes that you see people make that would ultimately make your life a little easier when they do show up on your doorstep?
Yeah, well, it's heartbreaking when guys show up with a car that has enough money spent to be a snappy little car, and it isn't, because they spent the money on stuff that doesn't work together. So the engine's an air pump. You've got to match up your cylinder heads and your cam and your exhaust and your intake manifold so that they all work together. And if you put a gigantic intake manifold on a 302 with a little cam and little heads, you end up with the parts fighting each other, and you end up with a combo that's just not going to work. But the actual parts choices are, I would say, less of an issue. The sort of biggest mistakes I see people make is fuel system. The number one reason why a car is turned away from the shop here without having the tune-up finished, it's not just Fox bodies, it's cars, period, is because the fuel system doesn't deliver enough fuel. And that can be a bad choice of pump. That can be failure to pay attention to details. Like, guys put a big pump in, they don't bother to change the fuel filter. On a Fox body, that's a $8 part. And you can buy it. I know there's parts for these cars that are getting to be not a same day, Napa in stock part, but fuel filter ain't one of them. You can buy a fuel filter any day, walk down to any parts store and you can get a fuel filter.
Okay. Now, one of the things that I know you took a lot of extra time on my car with, and I believe it's because this is somewhat of a common issue with the Foxbody platform, but the dreaded throttle position sensor, trying to oblong the holes out and get this thing set right so it would read appropriately and correctly. Because, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think these things right out of the box have issues.
Yeah, they can. I've seen situations where there's supposed to be a little centering grommet in the top of the throttle, and sometimes that's missing. It's usually loose in these throttles, so guys they screw around with the parts and the thing falls out. They don't pay any attention, and then they don't get the throttle position sensor centered. So that can be a problem where as it rotates, because it's not actually centered, it can rotate not cleanly, or it can even pop off the little tangs inside there. That can be an issue. I've seen situations where there's a clearance between the throttle position sensor and the actual throttle body, whatever, 60 thou or something like that. And if you just keep tightening, it bends the thing, and then you get a false reading. Or I've seen them suddenly, it's all fine, and then when you bend the thing, suddenly it reads 4 volts all the time or something like that. So there can be lots of problems like that, and it's usually related to aftermarket parts. You have an aftermarket throttle body, and you have an aftermarket throttle position sensor, and you're not paying very close attention to it. When you set these cars up, I think the right approach to getting them to run is to open the throttle body enough so that you're getting your almost your target RPM without benefit of the idle air bypass. This keeps the duty cycle low on the idle air bypass, makes the car a lot more controllable. It's a way that dramatically reduces surging, those kind of problems. And sometimes when you open the throttle enough for a big cab car to run, if it needs set 5,800, a car like my Wild Foxbody runs like 950 at idle. So sometimes when you open the throttle enough to get enough air going through to idle at the right speed, you can't turn the throttle position sensor back far enough without filing it to get it below a volt, which is what you're looking for. So, and if it's set too high, it does take an initial reading when you start the car to set as its baseline. But if it's too high, it will think it's in part throttle all the time, and this will cause it to idle hang and stuff like that. So I'll tell you another real common mistake is timing. There are 3 or 4 really common timing mistakes on these cars. Number one is guys don't remove the spout connector when they set the initial timing. And so when that happens, these cars all show up with timing that's 10 degrees retarded, and they never run worth a damn like that.
Right. Now, before I forget, I just want to make note or maybe have you explain a little bit, Mathew. You will work with folks from a distance, right? And or have the ability to do so. So just because someone's watching this in South Carolina doesn't mean that you can't give them a hand, correct?
Yeah, I can do a mail order chip for them, but it doesn't necessarily mean the car is going to work. It's not that anybody else is going to do a mail order chip that's going to work, because we're talking about physical problems, right? But it gets to be a hassle when guys are sending you the chip back and they say it doesn't work, and the problem is the car, but it's hard to prove that without having the car. So.
Okay.
So yeah, I help people remotely. I talk to guys on the phone all the time about their projects, but I don't do a whole pile of mail orders anymore. And usually the ones that I do are for guys that I'm fairly confident know how to troubleshoot the physical things on the car and have it assembled right.
Yeah. Oh, well, and I mean, I can attest to this. I mailed you back my chip there, and you were more than willing and happy to help, right? So
yeah, but I already had seen your car, so I already knew that it didn't have any of these other problems that get in the way. I mean, these are complicated systems that involve software and hardware and physical setup, and the problem can be anywhere. And if you're going to honestly solve problems on these cars, you have to be able to look at the whole thing. Sometimes the most likely issue is software. Well, that's great because that's the easiest thing to fix. But for me anyway, sometimes the problem, and a lot of times the problem on Fox bodies, is electrical. It's especially electrical problems because the harnesses are so chopped up on a lot of them. These can be hard problems to try and troubleshoot over the phone for guys. And sometimes, I hate to say it, but sometimes guys are just not straight with you about what's really going on with the car. They omit something, or maybe they just think it's not important or whatever. And that's what the problem is. So.
Yep, it's very true. And everybody likes pointing fingers. They don't want to blame themselves. So
you're kind of living in a world where personal responsibility is gone by the wayside, for sure. It's always better to find someone to blame. And the dyno guy is usually the first guy they blame for everything, because he's the last guy to touch the car. We can start with a little look at my 90 Coupe. This is a car that's kind of a pride and joy of mine. I think I've spent over 5,000 hours over the years building this car. Under the hood is a 399-inch Ford-based motor. It's a dart block 9.2 deck, so a Cleveland deck height. It uses 225 mains, which is the 302 main bearing diameter, and that's helpful in reducing the bearing speed on a high revving motor, where if you use the 3-inch mains like in a 351 Windsor, the bearings get the bearing speed's pretty high. The cranks speed of the bearing's pretty high. It uses a front drive belt driven distributor. It uses a completely custom intake manifold, which we developed here at Tecmotion just for this car. Inside the manifold is a stack style intake system. So you can think of it as 8 individual trumpets enclosed in a 1,000 cubic inch air box. It was set up to use a pair of 105 millimeter throttles. When we built the car, you could not buy a throttle over 105 millimeters. We begged guys to even build us a custom one, and no one would do it. So we set it up for 2, but I never actually configured it to run 2. By our estimates, we were going to get like 15 horsepower or something from that. And there was always something more important to do than try and get the linkage to work on a second throttle. It uses an electric water pump. It has a 3G alternator, which runs on a single 4-rib belt. Down here is an external belt-driven oil pump. Uses a -16. It's a wet sump, but it uses a -16 feed from the oil pan to that pump, and then it's -12 on the pressure line. There's a remote oil filter down here. Uses an MSD 6AL and a HVC2 coil. It's got Edelbrock 7721 casting heads. Those are the Victor Senior heads. They were ported by Mike Schmidt at Total Engine Airflow in Ohio. In case you didn't know, they share a facility with TrickFlow down there, and all of the TrickFlow ported cylinder heads are actually done by TEA. They're one of the great head porters in the US. These heads have the TEA 395 port job on them, which at the time, they were one of the most radical cylinder heads that was possible to put on a small Ford. They're a true inline head. They flowed 396 CFM intake and 310 CFM exhaust. So to put that in perspective, a nicely ported set of Victor Juniors, for instance, typically flow in the 290, 295 intake range. So the exhaust flow, which is notoriously bad on a Ford, is better on these heads than the intake flow on, a typical nice ported inline set of heads that lots of guys would consider racy. It uses a breather can. I always wanted to get vacuum pump on here, but everyone told me that the electric vacuum pumps were not really any good, and we could not figure out a way to add vacuum pump to our belt drive assembly here on the front of the motor, because we got the front mount distributor. And that front mount distributor, that Pro Stock style front mount distributor, is, I would say, well, they're quite unusual anyway, but they're extremely unique on a Ford. The typical reason for these distributors is on GMs with a rear mounted distributor, where they couldn't get enough firewall clearance to put a big enough cap on to avoid crossfire on radical ignitions. And so this has this huge cap, much bigger than a Fox TFI cap. I'm not even sure you can buy this Pro Stock style setup anymore. I think they actually switched to the Mustang TFI cap because it's big enough to avoid crossfire even in radical situations. But This was done up custom. There are no brackets for a Ford. You got to make everything, and it runs with a belt that runs off of the Danny B belt drive. Now the car, instead of using a timing chain, uses a belt timing system, because once you start getting up north of around 7,000 RPM, you can start to get harmonics problems with chain drives. So the belt drives are more reliable like that. It's a motor that's really designed to run 10,000 RPM, but we have it all set up and cammed so that it runs, we shift it at like 8,800. And by keeping the RPM down, I know it sounds funny saying we're keeping the RPM down on a 9,000 RPM motor, but by keeping the RPM down, you improve the lifespan of the motor. So, we're able to run about 350 passes on this without a refresh. Inside, the car uses a Lenco ST1200 transmission. Now, it evolved over the years. I have some historic video from 2007 that I posted up on my YouTube channel a little bit ago, when the car is running like 10.6s here in Alberta, and it had a Synchromesh TKO at the time, but we were throwing our power away with that clutch assisted shift. So I switched to the Lenco. There aren't too many guys who put a Lenco in a Fox and got it to work. In fact, at one point, Lenco was referring guys who were going to try it to me. I would get calls from these guys wanting to know how it was done. So, and it was a bit of a trial to get it to work, but it works good. If you're not familiar with it, there is some cool in-car video of this car in operation on my YouTube channel. And basically, it uses a McLeod soft lock clutch, which is a single disc slipper style clutch. You launch it with the pedal like you would any car, any manual transmission car. And then when you get it rolling, you just start jerking levers when the shift light comes on. And each one of those 3 silver levers controls one case on the Lenco. And the Lenco is like a stack of 2-speed power glides. So each of the 3 cases has an underdrive and direct, and that gives you 4 gears total. So our first gear total multiplication is 302, and then the top gear is direct. The car uses 488 rear end. This is some kind of old school stuff these days, but I use a 3-step, an MSD 3-step in here. So these dials here give you a configurable launch limit, which you can configure from the cab. So for instance, if you end up running behind somebody like a pro stock guy who lays a lot of rubber down, you might need a little bit more RPM out of the hole if the track's going to be really sticky. So you can just click that up a couple hundred RPM at the line if you want. And then it's got pills. This is the old school stuff. So there's a separate limit for burnout and a separate limit for race. So in the burnout box, we don't exceed 7,000 RPM. And then the race limit is, I don't know if you can read it or not, but it's actually 8,800. You can see it set there.
Wow.
And we come out about 62. In fact, that's how it's set right now, is to launch at 62. All right. This is the Mustang we're working on. It's the source of all the junk that's laying around here. There's a set of AFR 165 heads, which I think are the heads that you're using on your car.
Correct. Yeah.
They have been the subject of a piston to valve clearance check, which turned out fine. And some of the Play-Doh got into the in behind the valves, so I actually had to disassemble a couple of valves off this head to clean it up. But
there is nothing worse than that type of stuff. Hey, like you're just trying to make yourself sleep a little bit better at night, and you cause yourself a complete disaster.
Well, I'm building this car for a customer. I know lots of guys don't bother with these kind of checks, but that's how they end up with a disaster. I've been talking to a guy from Saskatchewan who's had a disaster like this where he touched all the valves, and it could have been avoided by looking it over. And of course, it isn't very happy when you buy a bunch of parts and then you do a PV check and it turns out they're not going to work.
Yeah.
But,
Or God forbid they were built on Friday and they're not within the spec that you assume them to be. It's it happens.
Right. But if it's way better to check it and then stop and replace the parts or make adjustments than it is to say send it and then blow it all to smithereens. So anyway, this all came up fine, looked good on paper, and it worked fine. But it's a time consuming deal to check everything on these cars. And this car, there's a little bit of it on my YouTube channel. I've already got the fuel pump and fuel tank install videos up there. It's a real clean stock car. But like a lot of these totally stock cars, like it's filthy. Look under here. There was all kinds of little oil leaks and whatnot, valve cover leaks and stuff. So the car is an absolute filthy mess. So in order to get this ready to put back together, there's just a pile of additional work, right? Cleaning stuff up.
Yeah, after 30, well, that one, it's probably what, a 88?
It's a 90.
90.
Yeah.
Oh, right. It's 91 that they went to that different convertible roof. That one I seen's got the sewing strip and the chrome ends on it.
Yeah. There's a bunch of the takeoff stuff. There's a big pile of parts there for it. There's an almost stripped right down motor sitting there. It's got the trick flow stage 2 cam in it already and a new timing set. And like I said, the piston to valve clearance check was done and the push rod length was measured and set up. So,
well, out of curiosity, Mathew, do you remember off the top of your head what the push rod length was?
6.4 inches.
Okay, that's where mine fell into place as well. So just out of curiosity, now, is that motor, everything on the bottom end stay in stock?
Well, the parts that are being kept are the block, the connecting rods, the crank, and the pistons and rings. So everything else, the pan will be put back on, cleaned up and put back on, but it's new oil pump. In fact, that stuff, I'm in the middle of doing that right now. It's getting a ARP drive shaft and a new oil pump. So,
and how many miles were on that car? I think you mentioned it in the video that you did on, what did you title that now? Super clean Foxbody or something?
Oh yeah, I've got right. This car was featured in a things to look for on what you need to know about buying a stock Foxbody. It's 120K, and you never want to put too much stock in the odometer reading, but this car has all the hallmarks of a car with 120K.
Okay.
For sure. There's a lot of other stuff taken out of it. You can see the old cam is sitting on the floor there, manifold.
Old E7 heads and.
Yeah, the old E7 heads are there. I weighed them. Those heads weigh 49 pounds, and the AFR 165s weighed 27. So
I reposted that there, and I got a lot of people reaching out with just like, wow, they didn't realize there was that much of a drastic weight change.
Well, I'll tell you what, this convertible probably weighs around 3,400 pounds. Changing the 2-cylinder heads out takes around 1.3% of the total car weight off. And it's all off the nose, right? And that's the total weight of the car. It's a sometimes forgotten element to changing the cylinder heads. When you put aluminum heads on, you make the whole front quite a lot lighter, and you rebalance the car a little bit. So 1.3% of the total car weight is nothing to sneeze at.
No, that's huge.
And it'd be a little bit higher percent on a coupe or even a hatch. The convertibles are the heaviest. So that's a kind of a tour of the shop. I guess maybe as a sort of final step as we go back to the front, there's the T5. It's in good shape. Still has an aluminum bearing retainer on it. So I'm going to get that out of there and put a steel bearing retainer on. And then the dyno setup is back here. See a lot of black marks on the wall. A lot of that is rubber. I mean, sometimes it's, greasy smoke or whatever coming off a car that's starts out set up wrong, but a lot of that is rubber. So
Got some good miles on that dyno.
Yeah, I've used it. I've used it a lot over the years for sure. Set up a lot of cars.
Agree. Well, I think that's probably a good note to finish things off on, Mathew. So thank you for taking the time and sharing the knowledge, and especially the shop tour. It's nice to hear people's stories, but then when you get to see the behind the scenes stuff too, I mean, it just brings the whole thing into perspective, right?
Yeah, well, the place looks like a disaster because I have parts everywhere. But I mean, I'm right in the middle of this build. In fact, when we're off this call, I'm going to go straight back to work, and hopefully, we're going to start bolting some stuff back on that motor today. So, anyway, I'll let you go, but it's been great. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks very much, Mathew.
Okay.